While the eyes of the world remained fixed on the beaches of Normandy, where Allied forces stormed ashore on June 6th, a far larger and more devastating offensive was about to erupt in the east. On June 23, 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a vast and crushing military assault aimed at the very heart of Hitler's Eastern Front. Despite its staggering scale, the operation would become one of the most underreported campaigns of the Second World War, even as it marked the true breaking point of Nazi Germany's military dominance. Following their victory at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the Red Army had seized the strategic initiative once and for all. That moment marked the end of German offensive power in the east. Over the following months, Soviet forces liberated nearly all of Ukraine in the south and pushed the Germans back steadily in the northern sectors. But in the center, in the vast forests and plains of Belarus, the Wehrmacht still held firm. Here, German Army Group Center occupied a dangerously overextended position. Known by the Soviets as the Belarusian Balcony, this bulge of territory jutted out towards Soviet lines and created a vulnerable salient ripe for encirclement. By May of 1944, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had begun preparing an ambitious plan to eliminate this entire German stronghold. The goal was clear: to annihilate 4 German armies across a front comparable in size to the entire United Kingdom. If successful, the Red Army would reach its pre-war borders and destroy the central pillar of Germany's eastern defences in one sweeping stroke. It would be nothing less than a death blow to the German position in the east. At the center of this operation was a narrow corridor of land between the western Dwina and Dnieper rivers, the historic Smolensk land bridge. It had long served as the main invasion route to Moscow, and whoever controlled it had a direct gateway into the Russian interior. German forces held it firmly with a 600-mile front defended by 4 major armies. From north to south, these were the 3rd Panzer Army under Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt, the 4th Army commanded by Colonel General Kurt von Tippelskirch, the 2nd Army led by Colonel General Walter Weiss, and the 9th Army under General of Infantry Hans Jordan. In total, Army Group Center fielded 38 divisions, but its strength on paper concealed a harsh reality. Those 38 divisions amounted to roughly 500,000 men, many of them under strength and exhausted. The forces had only 120 operational tanks, 450 self-propelled assault guns, and 775 aircraft from the 6th Air Fleet to support them. And despite the name, the 3rd Panzer Army had no panzers at all. All of the available armoured forces had been transferred south to prepare for a Soviet thrust into Ukraine, a thrust that never came. This left the central sector exposed and critically under-defended. The assumption by the German High Command had been simple: the next major Soviet offensive would surely come in the south. To counter that perceived threat, most of the panzer reserves had been positioned west of the Pripyat marshes, in the belief that Belarus was a secondary concern. That miscalculation would prove disastrous. What made the situation even worse was Adolf Hitler's iron-fisted refusal to cede any ground, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Determined to hold every inch of conquered territory, he declared key towns and cities in Belarus to be fortress positions. These were to be defended to the last man, with no retreat permitted. This obsession with symbolic defense points stripped the German line of mobility, initiative, and the chance to regroup under pressure. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, recognized the looming catastrophe. On May 20th, he presented 2 proposals to Hitler for a partial withdrawal. The first suggested falling back to the Dnieper River, the second to the Berezina. Both would have shortened the front and created much-needed reserves. But Hitler rejected both plans outright. To him, retreat was betrayal. The front line would hold, the fortress cities would be defended until the very end. That single decision, made not in some distant bunker but from the inner circle of power in Berlin, sealed the fate of Army Group Center. The Red Army was about to strike with overwhelming force, and the Germans would face it stretched thin, immobile, and abandoned by their own command. I still hear the distant rumble that woke us in the pre-dawn. Around 3 a.m, the earth seemed to tremble. In our sector, a sudden volley of artillery cut through the silence, high-caliber guns hammering our forward wire, then the whistle of shells passing overhead. I snapped awake, scrambled to my boots, and grabbed my rifle. Outside, the front line was a chaos of tracer flashes and panicked shouts. Men were running forward, backwards, sideways, no one sure where to go. Our company had been dug into a hedgerow near Orsha, thinly held. The orders had been, "Hold until relief," but we had no idea where relief might come from. Through the gloom I saw forms moving in the fields, Soviet infantry, moving fast, crawling among the vibrations in the ground. They were supported by tanks behind them, creeping through gaps in the tree lines. Our telephones were dead. The radio crackled with static, then silence. The map in my hand was already outdated. We fired on the Soviets where we could. Someone yelled a command. Whether ours or theirs I couldn't tell. The smoke thickened. In one shell burst, the hedgerow ahead collapsed, and men behind me were thrown down. I pressed myself against the earth and stayed low. It was all a weird blur, so much confusion and dread. That morning the lines did not hold. The German order to hold was drowned out by the sound of collapse. By dusk, we had fallen back 2 lines, leaving wounded men behind. That was only the first day. I did not yet know how deeply the trap would close. More German soldiers would die in the opening weeks of Operation Bagration than American troops lost in entire campaigns across the Pacific. In just the first month of the offensive, Army Group Center suffered more casualties than the US Army endured during the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa combined. This was destruction on a scale that dwarfed anything happening in Western Europe at the time, a disaster so vast that it would shatter the very backbone of Hitler's Eastern Front. Operation Bagration was named for General Pyotr Bagration, a celebrated hero of the Napoleonic Wars. In preparation for the offensive, the Red Army assembled an extraordinary concentration of men. Facing Army Group Center were 4 massive Soviet fronts. In the north, the 1st Baltic Front under Lieutenant General Ivan Bagramian, then the 3rd Belarusian Front under Colonel General Ivan Cherniakovsky, below them the 2nd Belarusian Front under General Grigory Zakharov, and finally the 1st Belarusian Front under Colonel General Konstantin Rokossovsky. Together, these fronts formed the greatest concentration of forces yet assembled on the Eastern Front. In total, 1,670,000 Soviet troops stood ready to strike. They were backed by 33,000 guns and mortars and an astonishing 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns. Each army front was allocated its own tank or mechanized corps to exploit breakthroughs, while separate tank brigades were embedded directly with infantry divisions to punch holes through the German front lines. Overhead, 5 full air armies totaling 5,300 combat aircraft, including almost all of the Red Air Force's long-range bombers, were assigned to support the offensive. Behind the German lines, 140,000 partisans operating under direct control from Moscow, prepared to sabotage railways, communications, and supply depots, ensuring that any German retreat would collapse into chaos. The Soviets had learned bitter lessons from the first 3 years of war. German troops were masters of the defensive fight, and sheer numbers alone had not always been enough to break them. In response, the Red Army created large-caliber artillery corps of unprecedented size. Each contained roughly 1,100 heavy guns, ranging from 76mm field pieces to massive 203mm siege artillery, alongside batteries of the dreaded Katyusha rocket launchers, whose howling salvos could obliterate whole sections of the front. By 1944, Soviet industry was producing war materiel at a staggering pace, especially the superb T-34 medium tank, whose sloped armour rendered most German 50mm anti-tank guns useless against it. German defenders were forced to improvise, relying on mines, explosive charges, Panzerfausts, and other short-range weapons to knock out the Soviet armour. Thanks in part to generous US aid through the Lend-Lease program, the Red Army of 1944 was far more mobile than the one of 1941. American trucks, jeeps, and even locomotives helped give Soviet forces a level of motorization their German adversaries could no longer match. This mobility would prove critical once the breakthroughs came. Yet even with these overwhelming advantages, the Red Army still struggled to equal the professionalism and tactical finesse of the German forces it faced. German formations, though depleted, retained a seamless system of command and control honed over years of campaigning. The Soviets, though vastly improved since the dark days of 1941, were still learning how to coordinate such enormous forces on the move. By mid-May 1944, however, the Red Army was ready. Operation Bagration was to unfold in two great phases. First, Soviet forces would smash the German front line along the eastern face of the Belarusian Bulge. Then they would encircle and destroy the German garrisons holding the key strongpoints of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk. The Soviets intended to deliver to the Germans the same kind of devastating encirclements, the infamous Cauldron battles, that had destroyed entire Soviet armies during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Now, 3 years later, they were determined to exact their revenge. The opening phase of Operation Bagration was carefully orchestrated to create the illusion of a broad front assault while secretly aiming for a devastating encirclement. The Second Belarusian Front was tasked with tying down German forces in place, drawing their attention into the centre of the Bulge. Meanwhile, the First and Third Belarusian Fronts were ordered to swing wide, enveloping the German lines in a vast pincer movement. Together, these two spearheads were assigned nearly 2/3 of the Red Army's reserves, tanks and firepower earmarked for the offensive. To the north, the First Baltic Front played a supporting role, shielding the right flank of the Third Belarusian Front and maintaining the critical wedge between Army Group Centre and North, a narrow corridor that Soviet planners were determined to pry open. In its second phase, Operation Bagration aimed for nothing less than the destruction of the main body of Army Group Centre. After breaching the German front and capturing key strongpoints, Soviet forces would advance westward, encircle enemy formations around Minsk, and drive toward the pre-war borders of the Soviet Union. It was a scale of operation the Germans had not anticipated, and once in motion, it would prove impossible to stop. In earlier years, catastrophic Soviet defeats could often be traced back to chaos at the top, poor coordination between fronts, overlapping authority, and unclear command structures. This time, however, things were different. Joseph Stalin and the Stavka had learned those bitter lessons well and now placed enormous emphasis on inter-front cooperation. To guarantee it, they assigned the highest-ranking officers in the Red Army to oversee the operation. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, was placed in command of coordination between the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts. Overseeing the 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts was none other than Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted battlefield commander. Their presence ensured that the massive multi-front assault would move in unison. Deception played a critical role in the Soviet preparations. Every effort was made to convince the Germans that the Red Army's next major blow would fall further south in Ukraine. Civilian populations were quietly evacuated from the front, not just for their safety, but to limit the risk of Soviet positions being exposed. At the same time, frontline Red Army units staged elaborate defensive preparations to mislead enemy observers. Staff officers conducted aerial inspections to ensure camouflage discipline was being followed, and frontline units rotated to the rear under strict radio silence to rehearse combined arms assaults. Behind the scenes, Soviet intelligence gathering intensified. With German aerial patrols virtually non-existent, Soviet air reconnaissance flights operated with near impunity, building a clear and detailed picture of German deployments and vulnerabilities. Despite all efforts to hide the Soviet buildup, by early June, German headquarters at Army Group Center had begun receiving troubling reports. Reconnaissance flights, captured radio traffic, and partisan activity painted a picture of something big coming. Initially, the warnings were brushed aside. German intelligence officers clung to the belief that the main blow would fall elsewhere. But by mid-June, the volume and urgency of these reports had become impossible to ignore. On June 12th, long-range Soviet bombers began launching coordinated attacks on German airfields, a clear signal that the offensive was close. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, still unable to convince Hitler that a massive attack was imminent, took the opportunity to leave the front and return to Germany on leave just days before the assault began. He would hardly have time to unpack. On the night of June 19th, Soviet partisans struck without warning. Across Belarus, rail lines, bridges, and road networks went up in flames. In some regions, all German supply trains were brought to a standstill. It was a calculated act of disruption, designed to sever the arteries of Army Group Center just before the Red Army moved in for the kill. 2 days later, on the night of June 21st, waves of Soviet bombers thundered across the sky, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives onto German positions. Amid the thunder of explosions, Soviet combat engineers crept forward under cover of darkness, using the concussions to mask the sounds of mine clearing and wire cutting. German sentries, alert and suspicious, began detecting unusual activity across the front. At 3 a.m. on the morning of June 22nd, exactly 3 years to the day since Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army struck. The leading infantry units surged forward, supported by tanks equipped with mine plows, smashing into the first German defensive lines. The general offensive began not as a single thrust, but as a series of concentrated encirclement operations designed to overwhelm individual sections of the front. In the north, near Vitebsk, a titanic artillery barrage battered the positions of the 3rd Panzer Army. As the northern pincer of the Soviet attack moved forward, the 1st Baltic Front's infantry formations broke through the outer defences, bypassing Vitebsk itself and moving quickly to encircle it from the rear. The trap was beginning to close. As Soviet shells thundered down across the Belarusian front, Field Marshal Ernst Busch was alerted by telephone that the Red Army's long-awaited offensive had begun. He immediately boarded the first available aircraft back to his headquarters. By late afternoon, he was on the ground, stepping into a command post already gripped by chaos. Reports streamed in with grim urgency. The left flank of Army Group Center was crumbling, and contact with Army Group North had been completely severed. The long-feared Soviet storm had arrived, and it was already beginning to cut through the German lines. Despite the sheer scale of the Soviet bombardment, one of the largest artillery barrages in military history, many German frontline units held firm. Hardened by years of Eastern Front combat, they dug in and clung to their defences. The Soviet infantry, advancing behind curtains of smoke and steel, met fierce resistance. Initial gains were modest, Penetrations of the German lines were shallow, and without coordinated infantry support, Soviet tank brigades alone could not achieve a breakthrough. Recognizing this, Soviet commanders made a bold decision. They committed their reserve tank corps earlier than planned. The gamble paid off. While the 3rd Panzer Army in the north bore the brunt of the opening blows, the other 3 armies of Army Group Centre, the 4th, 2nd and 9th, faced more limited pressure on the first day, but the balance would soon tip. At dawn on June 23rd, the guns erupted once again. This time, it was the turn of the 3rd Belarusian Front to unleash its power. Its target was the 27th Corps of the German 4th Army, positioned east and south of Orsha. This sector formed the southern arm of the Great Soviet Envelopment. The orders were clear: capture Orsha and press onward to Borisov, cutting deep into the German rear and linking up with the northern pincer. German defences at Orsha were spearheaded by the battle-hardened 78th Sturm Division, one of the most heavily armed infantry divisions in the Wehrmacht. The division resisted with determination, delivering punishing fire against advancing Soviet troops. But the weight of the Soviet assault was too great. Wave after wave broke against the German lines, and the defenders, though resolute, could not hold back the tide. The 78th was shattered in the fighting. What survived fell back in disorder. The first 48 hours had already been brutal for Army Group Centre, but the worst was yet to come. On June 24th, Soviet forces delivered their first decisive blow. The 43rd Army of the 1st Baltic Front and the 39th Army of the 3rd Belarusian Front linked up and encircled the city of Vitebsk. Entire German divisions were caught inside the pocket. The speed and precision with which the Red Army executed the maneuver stunned the German command. Soviet mobility, once seen as clumsy and uncoordinated, now moved with ruthless efficiency. Throughout the offensive, Soviet units demonstrated a level of coordination and operational tempo that left the Germans reeling. Among their innovations was a tactic known as the rolling double barrage, a brutal artillery strategy in which both forward and rear German positions were bombarded simultaneously. This shattered anti-tank positions, disrupted reserves, and left German lines blind and paralysed as Soviet forces crashed through them. Often Soviet armoured spearheads advanced so rapidly that they outpaced their own artillery. When that happened, air support took over. Waves of Soviet fighter bombers swept in low, blasting German positions and clearing the path ahead. Any Luftwaffe units attempting to counterattack were forced to fight through tight formations of Soviet fighters, only to be met by mobile flak units positioned to protect the Red Army's forward columns. German air power, already stretched thin, was steadily swept from the skies. To the south, the situation for the German 6th Army Corps under General Georg Pfeiffer had become catastrophic. Southeast of Mogilev, Pfeiffer's corps was hit with overwhelming force. After days of heavy combat, the corps shattered. Pfeiffer himself was killed in action 4 days into the fighting, one of several high-ranking officers to fall during the collapse. His replacement, General Helmuth Weidling, arrived to find a command in ruins. Every divisional commander under Pfeiffer had been killed. What remained of the corps fled west in broken fragments, scattered, exhausted, and leaderless. Army Group Centre was beginning to disintegrate. The Soviet offensive had not only broken through, it had begun to engulf. The Soviet victory in the Vitebsk-Orsha sector was more than a battlefield success. It was a total collapse of Army Group Centre's northern flank. 2 of the 3 corps that made up the 3rd Panzer Army had been annihilated. With them went any semblance of defence across the upper left wing of the German front. The road to Borisov now lay wide open to the southwest, while to the northwest, the strategic rail hub of Polotsk was exposed. The Soviet High Command placed immediate priority on capturing Polotsk. Though far from the main axis of the offensive, German forces still operating in that region posed a potential threat to the right flank of the First Baltic Front. There was no time to pause, no time to reorganize. General Ivan Bagramyan's troops advanced without delay, using the same envelopment tactics that had brought them victory at Vitebsk, rapidly isolating strongpoints, bypassing resistance, and crushing the enemy with overwhelming force. But at Polotsk, there would be no last stand. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commander of the German garrison, saw the writing on the wall. Rather than waiting to be encircled, he made the decision to withdraw on his own authority, a rare act of disobedience in the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. When Soviet units entered the city on July 4th, they found it empty of defenders. The capture of Polotsk secured Bagramyan's flank and removed any threat to the northern pincer of the Soviet advance. Further south, at Bobruisk, the Soviet offensive struck with even greater intensity. Here, the German Ninth Army under General Hans Jordan was the target, and opposing it was the most powerful Soviet formation on the front, the First Belarusian Front, under General Konstantin Rokossovsky. The direct approach to Bobruisk was blocked by strong German defences at Perichi, where engineers had fortified the route across dry land. The terrain to the east, however, was nothing but swamp, thick, waterlogged, and considered by the Germans to be impassable to large formations. They were wrong. Colonel General Pavel Batov, commanding the Soviet 65th Army, made a bold decision. Rather than attacking head-on, his troops would go straight through the swamp. German generals trusted a topographical symbol for impassable swamp, Batov would later write, and succumbed to the comforting idea that we would not be able to advance through it. But Soviet combat engineers had learned how to defy terrain. Working around the clock, they laid down corduroy roads, crude tracks of logs laid over mud, and within hours, infantry began pushing into the wetlands. The Germans, though watching the swamps, had posted no units inside them. On the first day alone, Batov's men advanced 6 miles through terrain the enemy considered untouchable. A Soviet tank corps followed close behind, turning a logistical miracle into an operational breakthrough. North and east of Bobruisk, the 3rd Soviet Army under Colonel General Alexander Gorbatov ran into stiffer resistance. German defenders here had been reinforced by the 20th Panzer Division, the only remaining mobile reserve available to General Jordan. It slowed the Red Army's advance but could not stop it. The Soviet assault began to drive a wedge between the German 4th and 9th Armies. As the front fractured, communication between the two forces was severed. Sensing the growing threat from Batov's swamp advance, Jordan pulled the 20th Panzer Division south to try and contain it, but by then its offensive power had been spent. The counterattack failed, and the division was mauled in the process. By June 27th, the Soviet trap around Bobruisk slammed shut. The 41st Panzer Corps and 35th Corps were now encircled in a pocket roughly 20 miles wide. General Jordan requested permission to break out while some cohesion still remained, but Army Group Center refused. Bobruisk had been declared a fortress, and its defenders were ordered to fight to the last man. That same day, General-Lieutenant Edmund Hofmeister, the city's commandant, sent a desperate radiogram to Army Group Center headquarters. His message painted a picture of unraveling disaster, complete loss of contact with the 35th Corps, panic in the streets, and mounting civilian and military casualties. Soviet artillery had already begun pounding the city. The final assault was moments away. On the night of June 27th, the Red Army launched its attack. Waves of infantry and tanks surged into Bobruisk under cover of darkness. Street-by-street fighting raged through the city as German forces, outnumbered and cut off, resisted with everything they had left. The chaos continued through the night and into the next day, but it was a hopeless fight. The fate of Bobruisk was already sealed. By the time Hitler finally authorized a breakout from Bobruisk on the evening of June 28th, it was far too late. The German position had already collapsed beyond repair. On the morning of June 29th, the shattered remnants of the encircled forces attempted to escape, but found themselves trapped inside not one, but two concentric rings of Soviet blocking forces. What few armoured vehicles remained from the 20th Panzer Division led the charge. They linked up with elements of Major General Gerhard Müller's 12th Panzer Division, which had been fighting from the outside in a desperate effort to reach them. Meanwhile, small disorganized groups of survivors from the 35th Corps managed to break away and flee north, eventually making contact with the withdrawing 4th Army. By early July, around 14,000 exhausted men from the destroyed 9th Army had straggled back to German lines. But the price was staggering. Over 80,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, while the Soviet strategy had called for rapid collapses at Vitebsk and Bobruisk. The objective in the center, at Mogilev, was different. Here, the Second Belarusian Front was ordered not to envelop, but to pin down General Kurt von Tippelskirch's 4th Army. The goal was to hold it in place while the surrounding sectors were crushed. On June 23rd, Soviet forces punched through the forward German positions and began driving west, slowly pushing Tippelskirch's army toward the Berezina River. The Germans initially managed to organize a fighting withdrawal to a secondary defensive line, inflicting casualties as they fell back. But the pressure never let up. The disciplined retreat quickly unraveled. Units lost contact with each other. Radio transmissions were missed or never received. 4 days later, Tippelskirch issued the order for a general retreat toward Borisov and the Berezina River, but many formations never got the message, and those that did were already too disorganized to carry it out in full. What followed was a chaotic flight. German troops streamed west, through woods and fields, hotly pursued by Soviet tanks, strafed from above by aircraft, and constantly harassed by partisan bands operating deep in the forests. Soviet units advanced aggressively, crossing the Dnieper River both north and south of Mogilev. On June 28th, they stormed the city itself. Roughly 2,000 Germans were still inside. They fought desperately but stood no chance. Those who survived the street fighting were marched into captivity. The battle for Mogilev had ended, but it had bought time that would soon prove critical. The night of June 27th saw heavy fighting in the city streets. German forces launched desperate counterattacks, trying to break out before the trap closed. But by midday on June 28th, troops from the Second Belarusian Front had reached the city centre. One by one, the last strongpoints were eliminated. The final resistance collapsed around the train station, where the last defenders were either killed or taken prisoner. To delay the Soviet pursuit and cover the retreating remnants of his army, Tippelskirch hastily organized a Kampfgruppe, a battle group, under the command of Lieutenant General Dietrich von Sauken. It was a scratch force, made up of whatever units could still be brought together: the 5th Panzer Division, the elite 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, military police companies, and even an engineer training battalion. They were sent to hold the bridges near Borisov and defend the crossing points over the Berezina River. The 5th Panzer Division was, unusually, at near full strength. Recently refitted, it had a battalion of 76 Panther tanks and another 45 Tiger heavy tanks from the 505th. It was a powerful force, one of the last armoured formations in Army Group Centre capable of putting up serious resistance. On June 28th, Field Marshal Walter Model arrived at the front. Appointed as the new commander of Army Group Centre, he was known for his talent in salvaging lost battles. He established his headquarters at Lida, a town roughly 100 miles west of Minsk, but even he had no clear understanding of what forces were still available to him. The front was in complete disarray. With radio and telephone lines down, communication with his scattered divisions had to be maintained by slow, low-flying Fieseler-Storch aircraft, fragile observation planes better suited for reconnaissance than command relay. Since June 26th, reinforcements had been trickling in. Hitler had finally begun to release reserve divisions, some from the High Command, others pulled from Army Group North. But they were fed into a meat grinder. Most, like the 5th and 12th Panzer Divisions, were committed immediately, piecemeal, into a front already collapsing. We were already cut off. There was no longer any clear line, just woods, scattered wrecks, and groups of men moving west without orders. On the night of the 28th, we linked up with remnants of the 20th Panzer Division, who had tried to punch a corridor open. Our Kampfgruppe, under Müller, was barely holding a forest road just east of the Berezina crossings. At dawn, the Soviets came again, not in waves, not like the old days. Now they came fast, with motorized columns, bypassing strong points and slicing between us. A T-34 appeared through the trees, less than 50 meters from our position. One of our last Panzerschreck teams got it in the track, but the second tank cut them down before they could reload. We fell back in 2s and 3s through smoke and the smell of burning rubber and flesh. My boots were soaked, not with water. The wounded were everywhere. Most didn't cry out, they just stared. That morning Müller ordered a final attempt to reach the bridges at Borisov. Our Panther was hit in the first minutes, a direct shell through the turret. I scrambled into a ditch and found 5 men from the 35th Infantry Division. One had no weapon, just a flare pistol. We moved northwest through the forest, aiming to bypass the road. Soviet aircraft crisscrossed above, hunting anything that moved. Once, a yak strafed a glade just as we entered it. The man behind me was hit in the throat. He didn't make a sound, just dropped. By noon, we were down to 10. The Soviets had passed us on both flanks. Fires were burning to the north. Borisov was gone. We reached the river by nightfall, but there was no bridge left. Just smoke and twisted metal. Some tried to swim. I didn't see them again. That night I buried my rank tabs and tried to sleep under a pine. The sky glowed orange in the east. It was all over, only no one had told us yet. On June 29th, Soviet tanks reached the Berezina River near Borisov. Red Army combat engineers worked rapidly, throwing pontoon bridges across the river to keep the offensive rolling. Von Sauken's Kampfgruppe, dug in and determined, held their ground. Their stubborn defense gave time for survivors from the 27th and 12th Corps to cross to the western bank, but it was a temporary reprieve. By the next day, Soviet forces entered Borisov itself. Heavy fighting erupted in the streets as von Sauken's units fought to delay the enemy. When it became clear the city was lost, he ordered a withdrawal behind the river. The bridges were blown, but by then the Red Army was already finding ways to cross. The few survivors who escaped from the east now faced an even more harrowing journey. The roads west were no longer in German hands. Soviet tanks patrolled the highways. The forests were filled with partisans who showed no mercy, cut off and hunted. German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and scattered into the trees, trying to find their way back to friendly lines through the ruins of what had once been Army Group Center. Burning villages, the crack of rifle fire and muffled explosions, all drowned out by the thunder of Soviet hurrahs, remembered one German soldier who somehow survived the inferno. If you were wounded or too sick to move, you were abandoned. That meant death. The marshes, the rivers, the dense forests, the heat, the thirst, the hunger, all of it tore through us like bullets. But we kept moving. The only thing keeping us alive was the unshakable will to reach the German line. With both Vitebsk and Bobruisk fallen, Army Group Center's flanks were gone. There was now nothing left between the Red Army and Minsk, only shattered remnants and empty road. The first phase of Operation Bagration had achieved its objectives with stunning speed. Soviet forces halted briefly along the Berezina River, pausing to resupply, rearm and receive fresh reinforcements. The cost had been immense. Many divisions were bled white. But while the Red Army's ground units took a breath, the Soviet Air Force did not. Their pilots remained in the sky, hunting retreating German columns. The Luftwaffe, overstretched and outmatched, could do almost nothing to intervene. The short pause gave Field Marshal Walter Model just enough time to piece together a fragile new defensive line running north to south through the town of Molodechno. From the few arriving reserve divisions, he tried to create a semblance of order, a temporary shield to slow the Soviet tide. Northwest of Minsk, the 5th Panzer Division made one final stand. On July 1st and 2nd, it fought a brutal battle against the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. The Soviets suffered heavy losses, the Guards Tank Army was nearly gutted, but so too was the Panzer Division. When the smoke cleared, it had just 18 operational tanks left. All of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion's Tigers had been lost in the fighting. It was a Pyrrhic victory that meant almost nothing in the face of the continued Soviet advance. On July 2nd, the vanguard of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps reached the northwestern outskirts of Minsk. Simultaneously, a Soviet mobile task force captured Nezvizh, cutting the last escape route toward Baranovichi. Before the final trap slammed shut, the Germans managed to evacuate around 20,000 wounded and rear echelon personnel, but it would not be enough. The next morning, Soviet tanks from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps punched into Minsk. German resistance collapsed almost immediately. By nightfall, the capital of Belarus was in Soviet hands, a powerful political and symbolic victory. Trapped to the west of the city were around 100,000 German troops. With General von Tippelskirch outside the pocket, command of the remaining 4th Army troops fell to General Müller of the 12th Corps. The Red Army pounded the pocket with constant artillery and air attacks. Soviet fighter bombers shredded convoys, and heavy guns hammered every suspected strongpoint. German units splintered. What had once been a coherent fighting force dissolved into isolated clusters of survivors. One group, several thousand men from the 78th Sturm Division, attempted to hold out under their commander, General Hans Traut. They were surrounded and annihilated. Traut himself was captured on July 6th. 2 days later, General Müller surrendered the remnants of his forces southwest of Minsk. It marked the effective destruction of the German 4th Army. For the next several days, Soviet troops and partisans combed the dense forests outside the city, tracking down scattered groups of stragglers. Few escaped. With Minsk liberated, the Soviet Third Belarusian Front turned its attention further west. Stalin's orders were clear: take the cities of Lida and Vilno by July 12th and establish a bridgehead across the western bank of the Neman River. Vilno, however, would not fall easily. The city was heavily fortified and defended by 12,000 German troops under General Major Rainer Stahel. They were determined to hold it. On July 7th, the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 3rd Guards Tank Corps executed a rapid bypass maneuver, swinging north and south to encircle Vilno from both flanks. As they closed in, a spontaneous uprising erupted inside the city. The Polish Home Army, the underground military arm of the Polish government in exile, rose up in an attempt to seize Vilno before the Soviets arrived. Their goal was political as much as military. While they fought against German forces, they also sought to assert Polish sovereignty ahead of a Red Army occupation. The message to Stalin was clear: Poland would not be quietly absorbed into a Soviet sphere. That night, German reinforcements arrived just in time. At dawn on July 8th, leading infantry units of the Soviet 5th Army launched their assault from the southeast. Soviet tanks closed the ring 2 days later, linking up just west of the city. Vilno was now fully encircled. For the next 3 days, vicious street fighting tore through the city, house by house, block by block. Soviet forces and Polish insurgents clashed with dug-in German defenders. The battle for Vilno would become one of the bloodiest urban engagements of the entire summer, but the outcome was inevitable. The Red Army was coming, and nothing could stop it. Inside Vilno, the fighting reached its most desperate phase. As Soviet tanks encircled the city, Polish resistance fighters struck from within. Their uprising, coordinated with the Soviet assault but driven by entirely different motives, created chaos behind German lines. The Wehrmacht defenders, caught between Red Army armour and insurgents inside their own perimeter, fought with bitter determination. The losses were staggering on both sides. Soviet casualties mounted as the battle ground on, street by street. From the west, German reinforcements launched desperate relief attempts. Columns from the 6th Panzer Division and elements of the elite Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division fought their way forward in an attempt to open a corridor. On the night of July 12th, they succeeded, just briefly, in creating a gap in the Soviet lines. Through that narrow passage, around 3,000 German troops managed to escape the Vilno trap, but the cost was appalling. 8,000 German soldiers were killed in the final days of the siege, and another 5,000 were taken prisoner when the city finally fell. By July 15th, the Soviets had secured their position on the Neman River. Combat engineers threw pontoon bridges across its western bank, and Soviet troops began establishing forward positions. The Germans launched furious counterattacks to dislodge them, hoping to prevent a further breakthrough, but the Red Army held firm and even expanded its bridgeheads. Now, East Prussia, the heart of Hitler's Reich, lay within striking distance. For the first time, the Red Army stood poised at the gates of German soil. Yet, as the battlefield shifted westward, another confrontation was already underway, one not of guns and tanks, but of politics and power. With Vilno in Soviet hands, Stalin's internal security services moved quickly. NKVD units rounded up Polish Home Army fighters who had risen against the Germans just days before. Those who didn't manage to escape the city were arrested and interned. The message to the Polish government in exile was unambiguous. There would be no negotiation, no sharing of power, and no recognition of Polish military independence. Stalin had no intention of allowing any anti-Soviet force to operate behind the advancing Red Army. But despite their momentum, Soviet forces still suffered setbacks. On the southern flank of the 1st Belarusian Front, Major General Philip Rudkin's 11th Tank Corps charged ahead without conducting proper reconnaissance. His armour ran straight into a well-prepared German ambush 2 miles south of Kovel. In just hours, 84 Soviet tanks were destroyed. The loss was so severe that Stavka immediately relieved Rudkin of his command, a stark reminder that even at the height of victory, recklessness could still cost dearly. Back in Moscow, Stalin prepared a theatrical display to signal the scale of his army's triumph. On July 17th, 57,000 German prisoners, most captured during the Minsk encirclement, were paraded through the streets of the Soviet capital. 2 vast columns of defeated soldiers, many of them wounded or sick, marched past silent crowds. Soviet forces continued their unstoppable advance. The border city of Brest fell on July 21st, and 3 days later, Soviet troops entered Lublin. It was there that the Red Army stumbled upon something even more horrifying than the battlefield. On July 24th, they liberated the Majdanek concentration camp, the first such site encountered during the war. The world was stunned. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, the Soviet authorities soon turned Majdanek into a prison once again. Once the emaciated inmates were evacuated, NKVD officers used the same compound to intern captured members of the Polish resistance. On August 1st, as Soviet spearheads approached Warsaw, the Polish Home Army rose up again, this time in the capital. It was the largest resistance uprising of the war. For 63 days, Polish fighters battled the Germans in a last desperate attempt to liberate their city before the Red Army arrived. But the Red Army never came. Stalin halted his advance just across the Vistula River, watching as the Germans systematically crushed the uprising. The Allies, unwilling or unable to intervene directly, dropped supplies from the air, but no real aid came. By the time the city was silenced, tens of thousands of Polish fighters and civilians were dead. Elsewhere along the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly forward throughout August. They liberated the last remaining German strongholds in Belarus, drove deep into the Baltic states, and reached the outskirts of eastern Poland. Then at last, the Soviet advance slowed. On August 28th, after more than 2 months of constant offensive action, the Red Army paused. That moment marked the official end of Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating and decisive military campaigns in modern history. In just over 8 weeks, the Soviet Union had destroyed over 25 divisions of the Wehrmacht, inflicted more than 400,000 casualties, and advanced more than 300 miles. Army Group Center, once the iron spine of Hitler's Eastern Front, had ceased to exist. What remained of the German military in the east was now in full retreat, and for the first time since 1941, the road to Berlin lay wide open. Field Marshal Model, despite his reputation for salvaging hopeless situations, could not prevent the catastrophe. By the time the dust settled, Army Group Center had been effectively annihilated. Of its original 38 divisions, 28 were lost in just over 2 months of fighting. The scale of the collapse was staggering. Official German records claimed 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, and more than 263,000 captured or missing. But these figures concealed an even grimmer truth. Entire units were listed as missing when in reality they had been wiped out to the last man. The forests and marshes of Belarus were littered with the dead, soldiers whose names would never be recovered. For the Red Army, the cost of victory was also devastating. Soviet records list 178,000 men killed, missing, or captured, and an additional 587,000 wounded. These were losses that would cripple most armies. Yet they were absorbed, endured, and overcome. Operation Bagration, despite being a triumph, had come at an enormous human price. But strategically, it changed everything. Bagration shattered any remaining illusions about the Wehrmacht's ability to hold the Eastern Front. It marked the moment when Soviet victory became not just possible, but inevitable. It was one of the largest and most destructive offensives of the Second World War, and it destroyed the core of German resistance in the East. For the Allies in the West, it raised real hopes that the war might be over by the end of 1944. And yet, the Germans kept fighting. Even with their armies in ruins and their homeland exposed, the Wehrmacht did not collapse. Across the vast front lines, German soldiers continued to resist, with discipline, with desperation, and in many cases with extraordinary tactical skill. Generals like Gotthard Heinrici, a defensive genius, fought stubborn holding actions that bought time and blood. At Silo Heights in April 1945, Heinrici delayed the Soviet assault on Berlin for days, even as the capital itself was already surrounded. By then, it was over in all but name. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker in Berlin. 1 week later, Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, travelled to Allied headquarters in Reims, France. There, on May 7th, 1945, he signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The following day, May 8th, the guns fell silent across Europe. Victory in Europe Day had arrived, but for the men who had fought through Operation Bagration, in the forests of Belarus, in the burning cities of Minsk and Vilnius, through the swamps, the smoke, the encirclements, victory had not come easily. For them, the war was not measured in maps or headlines, but in mud, blood, and memory. Yet for many in the West, it remains little more than a footnote. Ask the average person about 1944, and they will think of Normandy, of Omaha Beach, of the 6th of June. And yet in that same summer, far to the east, a campaign was underway that made D-Day look like a skirmish by comparison. On the 6th of June 1944, around 4,400 Allied soldiers were killed storming the beaches of France. On the 23rd of June, the opening day of Bagration, the Soviets lost that many men before midday. By the time the campaign ended, over 450,000 German troops had been killed, wounded or captured, more than the entire German order of battle in France. The Red Army suffered nearly 800,000 casualties of its own. That's over 1.2 million men in just 9 weeks. Entire German armies vanished. Army Group Center, once the backbone of Hitler's Eastern Front, was obliterated. 38 divisions were committed, 28 were wiped out. Some vanished into the forests of Belarus, never to be seen again. And yet, Bagration remains overshadowed, not because of what it was, but because of who it belonged to. The silence in Western media and history books was not accidental, it was political. But soldiers do not choose the politics, they fight, bleed and die in them. A German officer later wrote, "There was no front, only survival." We fought to get out, not to win. The air shook with Katyusha rockets. Men ran until they collapsed, then crawled. If you were wounded, you were left. That was Bagration. A Soviet veteran of the 5th Guards Tank Army described the advance like this. Every day we saw burning fields, animals still tethered in barns, villages abandoned and booby-trapped. Sometimes we advanced 20 kilometers in a day, sometimes we buried half a battalion. The fighting in places like Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk and Minsk was not just hard, it was annihilation. And for Poland and Eastern Europe, Bagration marked the final betrayal. The Polish Home Army fought to liberate cities like Vilnius from German control, only to be arrested, disarmed and deported by their supposed Soviet allies. Officers were executed. Fighters were sent to Siberia. In Lublin, the Soviets liberated Majdanek, only to repurpose the concentration camp for political prisoners, many of them Polish. The cost of victory was measured not just in blood, but in trust. The West celebrated the liberation of Paris. The East saw its capital seized by one occupier, then inherited by another. There were no parades for the Soviet infantrymen who fought through Belarus, no medals from Churchill for the Polish partisans of Vilnius, no Hollywood films for the crushed divisions of Army Group Center, fighting to break out across marshes and minefields under constant air attack, only silence. Operation Bagration was a turning point of the Second World War, but it was a turning point that no one wanted to talk about. With that, we'll bring this video to a close. If you enjoyed the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. I hope you found this deep dive into Operation Bagration both informative and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.